morning. How's everybody doing? It's great to be with you on a Monday night, commemorating the life of Martin Luther King. May his memory always be for a blessing. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Monday night as we get started? Rebecca in LA, Tom says happy Monday. Paul in Chicago, Renee in Indiana, Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehud in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Melissa in Great Neck, Carolyn in Raleigh, Patrice in Utah, Fred in Miami Beach, Bill in Mid-Missouri, David in South Bend, Indiana, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Carolyn saying, Nina enjoyed your 30-second righteousness lesson. Nina put out a video today on TikTok and Facebook. Fantastic. A really, really incisive, well put together, well argued, memorable lesson in 30 seconds. How about a lesson that we learn in righteousness from Joseph in Egypt? I agree with you, Carolyn. Nina did great. Julie in Texas, Karen in North California. Stephen loves this song, Yismechu by Shlomo Katz from his album Live in Melbourne. We're going to work our way through that one. Love that album. James in Indianapolis, Yehudit says amen. Fred, I was really getting into the music. Jeannie with us in Indiana. Sandy in Michigan. Sam in Central Virginia. Cheryl in Texas, Moshe desde Bogotá en Colombia. Bienvenido, Moshe. Qué bueno que estás con nosotros. Zach says, hey, Sal. Great to see you, Zach. As always, there'd be no AT without Zach Plotzker. Judy says, shalom, Paula loves the music. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago, and I'm glad you are. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Sue Strauss and dedicated to her parents, Herman Strauss and Ruth Krisky Strauss. May the merit of our learning accrue to them, and may all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen. And thank you, Sue, for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. John also with us from Lewiston, Maine, and over there on the YouTube side, Faith with us from Grants Pass, Oregon. All right, let's get into it. This is another great daf. We're learning here in Tractate Moed Katan, the 12th volume of the Talmud. Generally speaking, these are the laws of the intermediate days of festivals, meaning the intermediate days of Passover and Sukkot that are not the initial full-fledged festival days, nor the last full-fledged festival days of those week-long festivals, but the days in between, not counting Shabbos. And the basic idea is that these days are like a holiday, have certain characteristics, requirements of the holiday, but not full-fledged festival days when all work is prohibited other than cooking, which is on Shabbos, no work permitted, including cooking. Full-fledged festival days, no work permitted except for cooking for the needs of the festival. On these intermediate days, we try to avoid work, but as we've seen, two basic principles. Work that is necessary to avoid a significant financial loss, that's going to be permitted so long as it doesn't involve excessive exertion. All right, we picked this up at the bottom of 4b. And then go right into 5a. It was taught in the Mishna, so now we're back to our Mishnah. We're in Mishnah number 1 of chapter 1. It was taught in the Mishnah, during the intermediate days of the festival, one may repair damaged water cisterns in the public domain and clean them out by removing the dirt and sediment that has accumulated in them. Is it going to cause somebody significant financial loss if that work doesn't get done? No, but the difference here is that we're talking about the needs of the public. So now for the needs of the public, much more is going to be permitted, even if if individuals aren't going to suffer significant financial loss in the absence of this work being done, and even if it requires excessive effort, for the needs of the public is going to have different requirements. right? So one may repair damaged water cisterns in the public domain and clean them out by removing the dirt and sediment. And the Gemara infers cleaning out the cisterns of dirt and sediment during the intermediate days of a festival is indeed permitted, but digging a new cistern is not permitted. And Rabbi Yaakov said that Rabbi Yochanan said they taught that it is prohibited to dig new cisterns only when the public does not need them. But if the public needs a new cistern because the old one got damaged, and now if they don't dig this new cistern, there's not going to be, potable drinking water available for the public, okay, then we're going to have to dig a new cistern even during the intermediate days of the festival. And when the public needs them, is digging really permitted? But isn't it taught in a baraisa one may clean out cisterns, ditches, and caves of an individual during the intermediate days of a festival? And needless to say, one may clean them out for the public, but one may not dig new cisterns, ditches, or caves of the public during the intermediate days. And so we're actually gonna summarize this next discussion about whether you can dig a new cistern for the needs of the public during the intermediate days by just going to the halachas, where the debate ended up. Digging and cleaning the cisterns of an individual. So it is prohibited to dig new cisterns, a cistern, a well, right? So like a rainwater well. It is prohibited to dig new cisterns for an individual during a festival, even if he currently has only a minimal supply of drinking water. He's going to have to go somewhere else for his drinking water. He can't dig a new well during the days of the festival. As you can imagine, that's going to entail a lot of exertion to dig a new well. Too much work, too laborious, too similar to a regular working day the rest of the year. Repairing cisterns that have become damaged is permitted during the intermediate days of a festival if the individual needs the water for use on the festival itself. If he's not going to need the water in that cistern that's being repaired until after the festival passes, well, then he can wait until after the festival passes to make that repair in the cistern. It is permitted to fill a cistern with water on the intermediate days of a festival. The Magen Avraham adds that it is permitted to do so only by collecting water in vessels and bringing that water to the cistern. It is prohibited to transport water through a ditch, which is more strenuous, meaning you wouldn't want to dig a new ditch in order to transport water to this cistern that needs filling during the intermediate days. What about, so that's individual, right? People who on their property have their own rainwater wells. What about public cisterns? So it is permitted to repair public cisterns during the intermediate days of a festival and to clear them of stones and dirt, even if the public does not need them for the festival itself. These are needs of the public, so even though they don't have that need directly during the days of the festival, for the needs of the public generally, more types of labor can be done during these intermediate days. But one may dig new cisterns for the public only if they are needed by the public during the festival, right? So for the needs of the public, you can repair cisterns even if that need won't manifest until after the festival. But to dig a new well, that's only going to be permitted during the intermediate days of the festival if they need that for their drinking water during the festival. If they're only going to need that water after the festival passes, then we can wait till after the festival passes to dig the new cistern, even for the benefit of the public. When the digging of public cisterns is permitted, they may be dug even if they require strenuous effort and the labor is performed publicly, and even if this labor was purposely scheduled to take place during the festival. They had a choice. They could have dug it before the festival, but if it's going to be for the needs of the public during the festival, right? They're going to drink that water from this newly dug cistern during the festival, so then that's permitted, even though it involves strenuous labor, even though that labor is going to be done in a public place, which you might think desecrates the sort of character of the festival, but it doesn't, because everyone understands that this is a public cistern and that they're going to be consuming the water in it during the festival. And furthermore, about public needs during a festival, one is permitted to tend to all public needs during a festival, such as repairing and removing obstacles from roads, marking graves, and repairing ritual baths, even if one planned to do so in advance. And the Rima writes that this leniency applies only to the physical needs of the community. Other public needs, such as building a synagogue, may not be tended to during a festival if they require the work of a professional. So we see that even for communal needs, there's a difference, right? We've been talking generally about the case of irrigation and saving crops and, food, right? So we're talking about food, generally speaking, and drinking water. But now when we're talking about, can you work on the building of a synagogue during the intermediate days of the festival? It's for the purpose of the synagogue. It's a communal need since it's construction of a synagogue. But, that's not like an emergency. People could gather somewhere else. They don't have to have that synagogue finished. That work doesn't have to continue during the intermediate days. It would be better to do the building before and after. And, if it's not quite finished in time for the festival, okay, so they're going to gather somewhere else. All right. We pick this up a little bit further down on the A side of page 5 here in Tractate Moed Katan. It was taught in the Mishna, in our Mishna number 1 of chapter 1, that one may mark graves on the intermediate days of a festival so that passers-by will know to avoid them and not become ritually impure. As we've mentioned many times, a person who is tameh, somebody who became ritually impure, cannot enter the temple when the temple is standing. He cannot enter in a state of impurity. He's going to have to go through a purification process. Depending on how he became tameh, how he became ritually impure, will determine the extent of that purification process. For a simple tuma, he's just going to have to immerse in a mikveh, wait till nightfall, and then he can enter the temple. If he came into contact with a dead body, it's going to be a 7-day purification process where he immerses on the 3rd and 7th day, and then he has to be sprinkled with the waters of the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer, and then await nightfall, etc. When the temple is not standing, we study the laws of Tuma, but they're not quite as relevant, right? They're not quite as relevant as they are when the temple is standing. But we're studying them, and when Mashiach comes and the 3rd temple is built, well, these rules are going to matter again quite a bit. So we have to be cognizant of how it works. Why does a grave have to be marked? Because if you walk over a grave, then you become tameh, right? And still to this day, Kohanim do have laws that they cannot become tameh. They cannot knowingly come into contact or walk over a grave because of their special status as the descendants of Aaron. Kohanim no longer serve in the temple because the temple is not standing, but they do bless the people. Now, we don't have the ashes of the red heifer, so it's understood that sort of like everybody in the world is tameh. You can't ensure that you're in a state of purity and that you haven't walked over a grave or come into contact with the sheretz at some point. You can immerse in a mikveh, that you can do, and so you should be purified, but if in terms of contact with the corpse, you can't be purified without the sprinkling waters that contain the ashes of the red heifer. Nevertheless, people who are Kohanim, people who are descendants of Aaron, avoid going into a cemetery except for the burial of a very, very close relative. Okay, so now just take yourself back to ancient times when you do want to bring offerings to the temple is standing, so you have to know that you're in a state of tahara, ritual purity, so that you can enter. Okay, well, if you walked over a grave, then you have to go through that purification process. What are situations when you're not sure? Well, if you walked over a field and then later somebody told you, there was a body buried in that field. Did you know that? No, I didn't know that. Was it marked? No, it wasn't marked. Well, you might have walked over it. So now you have a case of doubtful impurity, and there's going to be a purification process for that. So that's why it was important to mark graves, especially like after a battle, a lot of bodies got buried, etc. So graves needed to be marked. And now we're going to be talking about this law of marking a grave and doubtful cases where there might be a body there might not be a body there, or there was a grave there, but then someone came along and plowed it. It was a shallow grave. And it was, many years after the corpse was buried there. So it was really just bones were left in the ground, but then they plowed through it. And so maybe those bones kind of got scattered over a wider area. We're not sure. So that's another case of a doubtful area, right? Where somebody might have picked up corpse impurity by walking over it, and how we handle that. All of this was very relevant at the time that people were making pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the festivals of Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuos, that if they, crossed over one of these areas where they might have walked over a grave, they need to know that so they can address it before they enter the Holy Temple to bring their festival offerings. Okay. So it was taught in the Mishna, one may mark graves on the intermediate days of the festival so that passers-by will know to avoid them and not become ritually impure. Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi said, where is there an allusion in the Torah to the marking of graves? How do we know that? It's a practical matter that if somebody walked over a grave, they have to deal with that. And if they don't know whether they walked over a grave, how are they going to deal with it? So it just seems as a practical matter that you should mark graves. But are we told directly somewhere in the Bible, you shall mark graves? That's what they're looking for. So where is there an allusion in the Torah to the marking of graves? The verse states, Ezekiel 39:15, and when they that pass through shall pass through the land, and any see a man's bone, then shall he set up a sign by it. Ezekiel prophesies that at some future time, the Jewish people will erect signs over the strewn remains of the dead so that others will know to avoid ritual impurity. Now, why does it say, do we find an allusion to marking graves? Do we find an allusion to this in Scripture? What do you mean allusion? That seems like a direct reference that you're going to be marking any place where there's a bone in the ground. Why is it spoken of as an allusion? Because it's not a mitzvah in the sense that you shall mark graves. Ezekiel is talking about some future time, right? So the third temple and what the third temple is going to look like, we know from the prophecies of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is talking about the future, right? When Mashiach comes, the redemption, we enter the Messianic age. So maybe it's at that future time that all the bones are going to need to be marked. All the possible graves are going to need to be marked. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in the Second Temple period and in the post-Second Temple period that we need to mark all the graves. So here too, one can ask, so that's, where am I? He shall set a sign by it. So Ravina said to Rav Ashi, well, before the prophet Ezekiel came and alluded to this obligation, who said that graves must be marked? Even before the time of Ezekiel, people were careful with regard to ritual impurity. So it must be that we had an obligation to mark graves. And Rav Ashi responded, well, and according to your reasoning that Ezekiel was introducing a new law, the same question can be raised with regard to this statement that Rav Chisda said. As Rav Chisda said, with regard to the law, that one who is uncircumcised or an apostate may not serve in the temple. In this matter, we did not learn from the Torah of Moses, our teacher. It seems obvious, right, that who's serving in the temple? The Kohanim who bring the offerings, etc., the Leviim who are serving the Kohanim, and the representatives of the rest of the nation of Israel who are in the non-priestly watches. Those are the people who serve in the temple, and among them, there should not be an uncircumcised person. Non-Jews can bring an offering, right, to the temple, as we've seen, can bring an elevation offering, but in terms of serving in the temple, that can only be a circumcised man. How do we know this? So this matter we did not learn from the Torah of Moses, our teacher, but rather we learned it from the words of the prophet Ezekiel ben Buzi, who said of such individuals, no stranger, uncircumcised in heart or uncircumcised in flesh shall enter into my sanctuary to serve me. Right? So not only does it have to be a circumcised male, but it has to be somebody who submits to the authority of God and to Torah. That's what it means to circumcise your heart. So here too, one can ask, before Ezekiel came, who said that such individuals cannot serve in the temple? Rather, you must say that originally they learned it as a tradition, and it was an accepted halacha, an accepted law for generations. And then Ezekiel came and based it on a verse. So here too, with regard to the obligation to mark graves, they originally learned it as a tradition, and then Ezekiel came and based it on a verse. And Rabbi Bahu said an allusion to the marking of graves may be derived from a different place in the scripture, in fact, in the Torah itself. Leviticus 13:45. And the metzora, in whom the plague is, his clothes shall be rent, and the hair of his head shall go loose, and he shall cover his upper lip, and he shall cry, Tameh, Tameh, impure, impure. Right? Now, this is always a little difficult for the modern ear. So what we're talking about is somebody who is physically ill, and it is a kind of illness that renders him impure, and anyone he touches is going to become impure from touching him. They're not going to become a metzora. Right? So this is often translated as a leper, but this is not the disease leprosy, where your fingers start to fall off. A metzora is somebody who has tzoraas, right, which is a physical manifestation of a spiritual malady, most often associated with lashon hara, wicked speech. That people who use their tongue for gossip and to humiliate others, and to make bad reports about other people, all kinds of lashon hara, that eventually they would be struck with tzoraas. Right. And so that becomes, it's like it's certain, like it's a skin condition. It's unpleasant. It's what Miriam had in the desert after she was sort of, questioning how Moses was behaving vis-a-vis his own wife. And then she had to go through a purification process, and, she was healed of her tzoraas and then was purified, went through the mikveh, etc. And then she could re-enter the camp. So somebody who is suffering from tzoraas has to mark themselves. The Torah says this, that they have to sort of rip their garments like a mourner does, and cover their head, and so they're physically, through their dress and their manner, going to be visually identified as somebody who's suffering from that disease. And not only that, but when they walk down the road, they have to let everyone know that they are in a state of ritual impurity. And they have to say, Tameh, Tameh, I am impure. Don't come near me. Don't touch me by mistake, because then you will become impure also. And that's part of their healing process to do that. So let's learn more about it. So Rabbi Bahu is saying that this obligation to mark graves can be learned from this law of the metzora, who has to walk around visually identified and calling out, I am impure, I am impure. And what does that have to do with marking graves? The idea that a source of impurity has to be, clearly demarcated in the public space, so that people can know to avoid it, not come into contact with it, just like marking a grave. Right? So impure, impure. That's Leviticus 13:45. And this verse teaches that tuma, impurity, ritual impurity, cries out to the passerby and tells him, remove yourself. The metzora must inform others of his status so that they know not to come into contact with him, and thereby maintain their ritual purity. And so too in our case, graves must be marked so that others will know to avoid them and prevent contracting ritual impurity. And similarly, Rabbi Uziel, the grandson of Rabbi Uziel the Great, said, impurity cries out to the passerby and tells him, remove yourself. Now the Gemara asks, but with regard to this verse, does it come to teach this idea that the people should be warned not to come into contact with it? Actually, isn't this verse needed for that which is taught in a different baraisa? And he shall cry, tameh, tameh, the metzora shall cry out, I am impure, I am impure. And this teaches that the metzora must inform the public of his distress. And the public will pray for mercy on his behalf. Totally different idea. The reason that the metzora is telling people that he is tameh, tameh, is so that they will pray for him and help him or her to heal. Right? So here we have the idea that, we in synagogue and regularly in our community, we pray for people that are ill. Right? We make a mishaberach for them on Saturday mornings. Right? And what we do is we don't embarrass anyone because we don't say like their first and last name. We don't say their first name and their father's name, which is how people were identified in ancient times. We say their first name and their mother's name, So like David, the son of Sarah, for example, right? David ben Sarah. I'm just making that up. And then, there's a lot of people who could be named David, the son of Sarah. So we're not sure exactly who it is, but we get that we're all praying for somebody named David, the son of Sarah. We don't embarrass them publicly by revealing that they're ill without their permission. On the other hand, but here the teaching is people should let it be known if you are sick, since prayer works, and prayer works even better when other people pray for you, like somebody who's ill is going to pray for themselves, and they should pray for themselves, and that prayer can be quite effective. But it's even more effective when other people pray for you, right? So the idea that a community is praying for somebody who is ill is right here. And so according to, who is this? Who's teaching it? It's this Baraisa. We don't know the identity of the Tana who's making this teaching, but they're saying that the reason the person cries out, tameh, tameh, is so that he'll be prayed for, not to get people out of his way so they don't become impure. And the Gemara answers, if it is so that the verse comes to teach only one idea, let it write, and he shall cry, tameh. What is to be derived from the repetition, tameh, tameh, impure, impure? Learn from this, the reiteration carries two ideas. First, the metzora must inform the public of his pain so that others will pray on his behalf. And second, he must warn the public to stay away so that they avoid coming into contact with him and contracting ritual impurity from him. Abaye said, an allusion to the marking of graves may be learned from a different verse, Leviticus 19:14. You shall not put a stumbling block before the blind. If they don't know that it's marked, they're going to stumble over it. They're going to become impure. That was avoidable if they were warned. So don't put a stumbling block before the blind. Make sure that things are clearly marked and people are warned. And Rav Papa said the obligation to mark graves is alluded to in a different verse, Isaiah 57:14. And he, meaning God, will say, pave, pave, clear the way. Take up the stumbling block out of the way of my people, which indicates that roads must be cleared of all obstacles and hazards, right? Not just boulders or potholes, but also hidden graves that would make a person tameh if he walked over it. Rav Hinana said, this may be derived, a different source, another source now, for why we must mark graves, from that very same verse, but I guess in a different way. Take up the stumbling block from the way of my people. I guess, or another person said it. And Rabbi Yehoshua, the son of Rav Edi, said, this may be derived from the verse Exodus 18:20, and you shall show them the way in which they must walk. You must properly repair the roads, which includes marking graves. Mar Zutra said that an allusion to this obligation is found in the verse, thus you shall separate the children of Israel from their impurity, which indicates that people must be warned to stay away from that which would cause them to become ritually impure. And Rav Ashi said it is derived from the verse, and you shall keep my charge, Leviticus 18:30, which means that you must establish a safeguard for my charge, i.e., protective measures must be enacted to prevent people from transgressing halacha, Jewish law. That's the foundation of all rabbinic decrees that form a fence around the Torah. right? You're not going to knowingly become impure if you can avoid it. But you're not going to be able to avoid it if you don't know where the sources of impurity are. So we have to mark them so that a person can can act cautiously. And so, protective measures must always be enacted to prevent people from transgressing halachas, a task that includes distancing people from ritual impurity by marking off graves so that they do not come to convey ritual impurity to teruma or other consecrated items. It's not a transgression to become tameh, right? It happens. It happens to people, without their control. They didn't do anything wrong. It's important to understand that if you become ritually impure, you have to go through a process before you can enter the temple, but it's not like we blame you for doing something wrong. On the other hand, if you become tameh and you knowingly enter the temple, then you definitely did do a transgression. Even if you unknowingly enter the temple, that's the transgression. Now, you'll be forgiven if you did it unintentionally, but you're going to be liable to bring a sin offering for doing that. Likewise, if you come into contact with teruma, the produce that's set aside for priests, right? That first 2%, which only priests can eat, but they can only eat it in a state of purity. The priest has to be pure, and the teruma has to be in a state of purity. So if a person comes into contact with ritual impurity and becomes tameh, and then he touches the teruma, so now the teruma is spoiled. It can no longer be eaten by the priest. It's going to have to be burned. And finally, Ravina said this obligation to mark graves is alluded to by the verse, Psalm 50, verse 23, and to him who orders his way, I will show the salvation of God. Meaning that one must mark the pathways that are ritually pure and upon which it is appropriate to walk, right? Him who orders his way, I will show him the salvation of God. You have to sort of order your affairs. Part of that means a society has to order its affairs so that people aren't coming into contact with graves when it could have been avoided. But also, you yourself have to examine your deeds. With regard to this verse from Psalms cited above, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, whoever appraises his ways in this world and contemplates how to act in the most appropriate way possible merits to see the salvation of the Holy One, blessed be He, as it is stated, and to him who orders his way. Do not read it as Vesam, who orders. Rather, read it as Vesham, appraises, who appraises. And with this reading, the verse indicates that one who appraises his ways, him will I show the salvation of God. Makes perfect sense. A person who appraises his ways, right? Somebody who examines his deeds, who asks himself, continuously, all the time, regularly, every day if possible, every night if possible. Always ask yourself, am I doing the right thing? This isn't all about introducing doubt into your life and becoming a fear-obsessed person, but rather just examining your ways. Like, are you living a righteous life? Could you be doing better? Could you be more fruitful in this world? Could you avoid transgressions a little bit better? By making that kind of examination, by asking that kind of question, you're already well on your way to living a more righteous life. And if you live a righteous life, or at least a more righteous life, so you're going to have, first of all, a higher place in the world of souls when you leave this world. And God willing, we'll all be resurrected and we'll be brought back at the time that Messiah comes. And there's resurrection of the dead, and we will inherit the world to come. Right? We'll have a place in the world to come. And getting there is greatly assisted by examining our deeds regularly. Rabbi Yanai had a certain student who would raise difficulties with his teachings every day as they were learning. On Shabbos of a festival, when the broader public would come to hear the lesson, the student would not raise any difficulties, lest Rabbi Yanai lack an immediate answer and suffer embarrassment. And Rabbi Yanai, now we're at the B side of page 5, Rabbi Yanai read this verse about his student, and to him who orders his way, I will show the salvation of God. For he considered his conduct and determined when it was appropriate and when it was inappropriate to challenge his master, right? That's a good student. He has lots of questions for his teacher. His teacher can't always answer them. It's difficult for the teacher. This is such an advanced student. But that student won't do that in a public setting where it could come to embarrass his teacher. New subject. With regard to the halakhas of marking graves, the sages taught the following baraisa. The courts do not mark the area of an olive bulk of a corpse, right? That is the volume of one olive, right? If that's all that's left of that dead body. So they don't mark that area. Nor of a bone that is the size of a barley grain bulk. Nor of any item that imparts impurity only through physical contact, but does not impart ritual impurity by means of a tent to an individual or object that it overshadows, or that is overshadowed by it, or that is found together with it under the same structure. Impurity of a tent. If like with a corpse, if you walk over it, you're going to get that impurity. If you're standing next to it, you won't, unless you and the corpse are under a ceiling, some kind of a roof. If you're sharing a roof with a corpse, right, then everything that's under that roof is going to become tameh. So what they're saying here is these are some minimum measures of how much, of that, rotting away corpse has to be present before you have a requirement to mark the grave or the situation. Is there a roof? Is there a roof overhead? Now that roof doesn't have to be like a ceiling of a house. It could even be just some structure like an overhanging tree branch, but now it's over your head and the corpse, there's a grave over there. I'm standing over here. I didn't walk over the grave, but the grave and I are both under a tree branch, so I could get impurity of a tent that way. And so it needs to be marked. Similarly, they do not distance the marker. By means of the tent. But they do mark the area of the spine of a corpse, the skull, or the bones that comprise the majority of the skeletal structure, or the majority of the number of bones in the body. And furthermore, they do not mark the area of certain ritual impurity, i.e., a place that is known to all as ritually impure, but they do mark a place of uncertain ritual impurity. In other words, if it's already marked in some way, you don't have to further mark it. Like if they know that this whole field is a funeral field, is a cemetery field, and it has fairly clear parameters, okay, you don't have to go in and mark it even more clearly. It's known. And these are places, but they do mark places of uncertain ritual impurity. And these are the places of uncertain ritual impurity. Overhanging boughs, protrusions, and a base haperas. And they do not erect, and what is a base haperas we'll get to, and they do not erect the marker directly over the site of the ritual impurity so as not to cause a loss of ritually pure food items, as one who is carrying such food might inadvertently walk up to the site of ritual impurity and only then notice the marker after he's already crossed it. In other words, you have to mark the area that the ritual impurity, you need like a few markers around its border, not just one in the middle, and by the time you noticed it, you already walked over some graves. And similarly, they do not distance the marker from the actual site of ritual impurity so as not to cause a loss of Eretz Yisrael. They don't put the marker too far away from the grave that was previously unmarked, and they don't mark it right on top, right? So it's like some kind of reasonable distance around it so that it's marked clearly and people know to avoid walking over it. And Rav Papa, and the Gemara begins to analyze this baraisa by asking, so is it really so that an olive bulk of a corpse does not impart ritual impurity by means of a tent? Right, that if there's only an olive bulk, and then you know where it's buried, and there's some let's say a tree branch that's overhanging that grave, and so don't you become ritually impure from that? But didn't we learn in a Mishna? These are the items that impart ritual impurity by means of a tent, and among other items, this list includes an olive bulk of a corpse. And Rav Papa said, here we are dealing with a case where the piece of flesh is exactly an olive bulk, which, as it decays, will ultimately diminish in size to less than an olive bulk, and that's why we don't need to mark this. Accordingly, it is preferable that teruma and consecrated items be burned because of it for the time being, in a case where one inadvertently encounters this impurity because it was not marked, and consequently one must burn any teruma or consecrated items that became ritually impure, and not be burned because of it forever afterwards. In other words, when there's so little of it, we don't want to set up a marker where people are going to think for generations that that's a place that, oh, they came into contact with it, and if they had some teruma in their possession, that teruma needs to be burned. Because, within a relatively short time, that olive bulk is going to be reduced to less than an olive bulk of corpse flesh, and then there's nothing there that can render the one who crosses over it ritually impure. So we don't want to mark that spot. Right. And the Gemara continues to explicate this baraisa about minimum measures and graves. And these are the places of uncertain ritual impurity, overhanging boughs and protrusions and a base haparas. The Gemara explains, overhanging boughs, this is referring to a tree that hangs over the ground next to a cemetery, and under one of its branches there might be a corpse. So if there is a corpse there, the branch overhanging it creates a tent, and therefore it imparts ritual impurity to anyone who passes under that bough. If there's a grave anywhere under that tree branch, then anyone who passes under that tree branch, even not over the grave, is going to become tameh. So that's why you need to mark that that tree branch is over a grave at anywhere along its length. Protrusions, this is referring to protruding stones that jut out from a wall and are not flush with it, under which there might be a corpse. Once again, if the stones protrude over a corpse, they create a tent and impart ritual impurity to anyone who passes underneath that protruding stone. The definition of a base haparas is, as we learned elsewhere in a Mishna, in Tractate Oholot 17:1. One who plows a field containing a grave, thereby raising a concern that bones may have become strewn throughout the field, renders the field a base haparas. And how much of the field does he render a base haparas? The full length of a furrow, which is 100 cubits. So, that's a pretty good long distance. It's 150 feet. And the Gemara asks, does a base haparas really impart ritual impurity by means of a tent? Right. So we had a case where there's a situation where, let's say there was a battle and some of the soldiers who died were buried in a field near the battle site, but they didn't get grave markers. So we know some bodies were buried there. We're not sure exactly where. Okay. So that's an issue. So now what we have is a field where there's a corpse somewhere under that, in the ground, in that field. We're not sure where. That field should probably be left alone. If somebody came along and plowed that field, now it's, and many years after the bodies were buried there, now it's a different situation. Now it's like whatever body was buried in that field and we're not sure where it was buried, now it's quite possible that little bone fragments got spread out all over that field. So it's sort of like a much lower density. In the first case, we don't know where the body is, but somewhere in that field there's a body. And now if it got plowed, okay, so now there's little bits of that body in many parts of that field, and we have to assume they're everywhere throughout the field. So this is going to have different results. So the first question, does a base haparas really impart ritual impurity by means of a tent? Little bits of bone got spread out all over the field, but in every one spot of that field, there's only little tiny particles, right? So it's not like there's a whole body in one part and we just don't know where it is. But now throughout the field, there's just very little pieces, not big enough to transmit impurity by way of a tent, right? That being under some kind of overhanging roof, it's going to spread tuma. So does a base haparas really impart ritual impurity by means of a tent? But didn't Rav Yehuda say that Shmuel said, if a person is carrying ritually pure items, like teruma, the kind of food that can only be eaten in purity and by a priest, if a person is carrying ritually pure items, or he wishes to remain ritually pure so that he may consume consecrated items, or so that he may enter the temple when the temple is standing, and yet he must cross a base haparas, there's no other way for him, right? He's entered it before he realizes, and now he has to cross it. Well, what is he to do? He may blow upon the earth in the base haparas before each step to clear away any little tiny bones that may have become strewn across the field. and then he may proceed to walk across the area, and he will remain ritually pure. This indicates that there's no concern about contracting ritual impurity by means of a tent in a base hopros because all the pieces are so tiny. Otherwise, it would be prohibited to cross in this way, as it is possible that in the course of blowing, one may have already contracted ritual impurity by leaning over the bones or passing over the bones that are buried beneath the surface, that you might cross over the unknown, unmarked grave. It's like there is no more grave. It's just that the little bits of bone got spread out all over the field. And because they're so small, you can kind of clear a path before you, and that's good enough. Similarly, Rav Yehuda bar Ami said in the name of Ula, a base hopros that was trampled, i.e. a well-trodden base hopros, is ritually pure, as passersby have already cleared away any bones with their feet. If a base hopros were to impart ritual impurity by means of a tent, there should be a concern that the bones may have been trampled upon and buried in the ground. Both of these sources prove that a base hopros does not impart impurity by means of a tent, and that seems to contradict the Mishnah. So Rav Papa said, La kasha, it is not difficult, as a distinction can be made between different types of base hopros. Here, where the Baraisa states that a base hopros must be marked because it imparts tent impurity, it is referring to a field in which a grave was lost. There might have been one body that got, plowed up and spread around, but before that, there was a grave that was lost. And somewhere in this field, there's a grave. i.e. a field that was known with certainty to contain a grave, though its precise location can no longer be recalled. Therefore, if there's something overhanging that field, like a tree limb, we can't be sure that that lost grave isn't under the tree limb. So if we pass under that tree limb, then we become ritually impure through doubt. There, where it is ruled that a base hopros does not convey tent impurity, it is a case of a field where a grave was plowed, and it is not at all clear whether there are bones strewn across the field. In that case, ritual impurity is not imparted by means of a tent, and so it need not be marked. Right? So two different cases where there was a grave there and the field got plowed, so the little bits got spread out, or the field didn't get plowed, there was a grave in that field, we don't know where it is, so we have to assume that any spot that you walk over, and especially if you walk under a tree limb, that you might become impure because you walked through such a field. And the Gemara asks, but a field where a grave was plowed, but is a field where a grave was plowed called a base hopros, such that one must be concerned about its ritual impurity? And the Gemara answers yes, and so we learned in the Mishnah at Ohalot 18:2, there are three types of base hopros through which those who eat teruma and consecrated items are prohibited to walk, meaning a Kohen. And a field in which a grave was lost and its precise location is no longer known, that's number one. Number two, a field in which a grave was plowed and bones may have been scattered about. And number three, a weeper's field. And the Gemara asks, what is meant by a weeper's field? A field of weepers, right? People who weep. And Rav Yehoshua bar Abba said in the name of Ula, a field where those escorting the deceased would take leave of the deceased and there hand the corpse over to those who would perform the actual burial. It was kind of like the waiting area where the people would bring the body and hand it over to the grave diggers who would then take it into the cemetery and bury it. So in this area, there was concern that, parts of bodies could end up if that place was used in that manner. Rav Yehoshua said in the name of Ula, a field where those escorting the deceased would take leave of the deceased. And what is the reason that one must be concerned about the ritual impurity in a weeper's field? I mean, it sounds like, well, there's nobody buried there. It's just that a body passed over it and then later was taken somewhere else to be buried. But Avimi said, it is due to the possible despair by the owners of recovering bones it is because of the despair of the owners of recovering bones that the sages touched upon this idea. There is a concern that in transporting the deceased from far away, a loose limb may have fallen from the corpse into the field, and unseen by those transporting the deceased, it was abandoned there. And since over time, many corpses passed through this weeper's field, it is assumed that ritual impurity might be found in many places throughout the field. And the Gemara asks, and does a field in which a grave was plowed not require marking? But isn't it taught in a Baraisa? If one encountered a field that was marked due to ritual impurity, and it is no longer known what the nature of that ritual impurity was, so if there are trees in the field, it is known that a grave was plowed in it, as it is permitted for one to plant trees in such a field. But if there are no trees in the field, it is known that a grave was lost in it, as it is prohibited for one to plant trees in such a field. If a field is suitable for planting trees, and yet there are none, clearly it is because a grave was lost there. And Rabbi Yehuda says, we do not rely on these signs unless there is an elder or a rabbinic scholar who can testify about the subject, as not all people are experts in this matter. And perhaps the field was not plowed at all. In any case, this Baraisa teaches that a field in which a grave was plowed gets marked. And the Gemara answered, Rav Papa said, when that Baraisa concerning a marked field is taught, it is taught with regard to a field where a grave was certainly lost, and then they immediately marked it. However, if there are trees in the field, it is known that a grave was later plowed in it, i.e., it was forgotten that a grave had been lost in the field, and so it was inappropriately plowed and prepared for planting. And at that point, we no longer worry about corpse impurity through a tent, because all the pieces now have become small, but the field still needs to be marked, and you can't walk through it. But if there are no trees in the field, we know that a grave was lost in it and it was not later plowed. And the Gemara raises a question about this ruling. But let us be concerned that perhaps the trees were located inside the field and the grave was located outside of the field, and the actual site of the grave was never plowed, but it was simply lost. So how then can one rely on the presence of trees to indicate that the grave had been plowed in the field? And I'm just about done. The Gemara answers, it is as Ula said elsewhere. This is a case where the trees are standing along the field's boundaries, next to a public domain, as the grave is certainly not outside the trees in the public domain, since people do not bury a corpse in the public thoroughfare. Rather, the grave must be between the trees and was therefore plowed. Here too, then, this is a case where the trees are standing along the borders. And so we have this idea that, how do we get to this discussion? Because we're talking about serving the needs of the public during the intermediate days of the festival. And marking graves is going to be something that is permissible to do because it serves the needs of the public. Even if it requires strenuous effort, it can be done during the intermediate days of the festival. And then we got into this discussion about marking a field where it's uncertain what's there. Was it a grave that was plowed? Was it a grave that was lost? It's going to, have sort of different outcomes. And this sort of, tracking down the evidence, as it were. Was it a field where a grave was lost, or was it a field where a grave was plowed? The presence of trees can give us a hint, can give us a clue of which type of field it is. But as the sages show, it's not dispositive. It's just a likelihood. But that's important because, again, people have to make policy decisions. And so based on the preponderance of the evidence, as it were, they can mark the field in one way or the other. All right, let's go to questions and comments. Lucy, how would one define a public cistern? Does it have to be in a public domain? How about a cistern in a courtyard that serves several families? It's a great question. They didn't indicate that at all. Obviously, for sure, if it's going to serve the pilgrims coming up to Jerusalem, that's public. If it's going to be open to all the members of a town, that serves the town. Public reservoirs, etc. That's obvious. But if it's on private property and just serves the people who share a courtyard, is that public? I'm not sure. Great question. Sharon, don't we need to properly mark a grave out of respect for the deceased themselves, not only to protect the living from ritual impurity? Absolutely. Absolutely. But it might be that in this situation, I think what they're talking about is elsewhere in the notes here, it says there is absolutely an obligation, or not here, I just did a little research earlier. There is an obligation to bury the dead. There's an obligation to set up a grave marker of the dead. That obligation is on the family. The money for a gravestone and a burial plot should come out of the estate of the deceased. But the obligation is incumbent on the family, and if there's no family to do it, then on the community to mark the grave, right? Not just that a person lies here, but who lies there. But, when we're talking about cases of war and there were battles and a lot of people died, it might well be that they don't know who died there. So they can't set up that kind of a grave marker, but, the public needs to know that someone is buried there. And I think you would still say, Sharon, that, yeah, okay, fine, you don't know who it is, but at least set up a grave marker that, somebody is lying here just out of respect to the dead. And I think that you're absolutely right. It doesn't contradict what we're saying here. It just augments it, that serves the needs of the individual, right? That's out of respect to the dead. But here what we're talking about in terms of the intermediate days of the holiday is the public needs, right? And so, an unknown grave, marking it, how does that serve the public because of this issue of ritual impurity? With respect to the laws of the metzora saying tameh, tameh as they walk around, Renee, is the apostate obliged to announce himself? No. No, I don't think that we have that. The apostate, somebody who turns his back on, like a Jew who turns his back on Judaism. I think it's another word for that is a heretic. That person is unlikely to, it's like they're not going to follow Torah law. So what is the purpose of that there would be a Torah law requiring them to identify themselves? They don't follow the law, so they're not going to do it. The point about the apostate is that they, we who know that person is apostate will prevent that person from serving as a Cohen or a Levi or in a non-priestly watch in the temple. I mean, that's only logical. That the people who serve in the temple should have utter love and respect for the laws of the temple. But in terms of the one who has to say tameh, tameh, and an apostate, by the way, is not necessarily tameh, right? They're just prohibited from serving the temple because they're an apostate, not because they're tameh. But in terms of the one who is a metzora, that is one of the ways that a person can become tameh. You might say, well, somebody who just walked over a grave and became tameh that way, because that person is tameh. Do they have to say tameh, tameh as they walk around? No, they don't. They should, make an effort to avoid people so that they don't make them impure. But we don't have that requirement. The only one who's required to announce that he is tameh is the metzora, and that's would seem to square with what we learned here. That it's not just that they say tameh so other people avoid them. But avoid coming into contact with them, but also so that others will pray for them because that's part of their healing from tsuras. Renee, doesn't the heretic impart ritual impurity? No, I don't think so. I don't think they do. The fact that they're a heretic doesn't make them tameh. You become tameh by coming into contact with a source of tumah. I don't recall hearing that the fact that you professed that you would worship another deity than God, that therefore you are now tameh. You're not. We might assume that you are tameh because the heretic is, once he's turning his back on Torah, so he's not going to go out of his way to avoid sources of tumah. And so we might have an assumption that that person is tameh, not because heresy makes you tameh, but because somebody who doesn't care about Torah also won't care about coming into contact with tumah. And maybe that's how that works. Yosef, we encounter frequently this phrase that a certain rabbi interpreted something homiletically. In Talmudic terms, what does it mean to interpret something homiletically? Meaning that they can, go into the verse and pull out another law or another teaching, right? Beyond just what's the surface meaning of the word. Homiletically just means that they can derive deeper teachings and especially halachas, laws, that are not immediately apparent from the written verse. And Caroline, last question, can you please elaborate on distinction between righteousness and lack of impurity? Meaning, could one lack impurity and still be considered not righteous? 100%. These are not really similar concepts. Righteousness, right, is tzedek, justice, right? So that, or somebody's a tzaddik, right? That's a righteous person. That's what Nina taught about today. Yosef HaTzadik, right? That Joseph in Egypt was a tzaddik, even though he was surrounded by all kinds of idolatry, he remained true to God and the Judaism of his father Jacob. Tahara is purity, and that's as opposed to tuma, impurity. So righteousness and purity are actually not tied together. It may be that people who are righteous want to avoid impurity so that they can enter the temple at any time or so that they can eat consecrated foods, etc. But, being a righteous person, you can be a righteous person and come into contact with a corpse, and then until you go through the purification process, you'll be tameh. You're not a less righteous person because you became tameh. Anybody can become tameh. In fact, it's sort of like the highest level of righteousness to attend to the needs of a corpse, right? Especially like a corpse that has no one to bury it, or a corpse that needs watching over through the night until it can be buried the next day, or a corpse that's being prepared for burial and you're going to put shrouds on it. So you will definitely become tameh by handling the corpse and attending to its needs. And in doing so, you're doing an act of very high righteousness. So you're a very righteous person that became tameh on purpose in that situation to help to do the ultimate kindness, since the dead one cannot return the favor. Right, so there you see that righteousness and purity are two distinct ideas. And the opposite of impurity is not righteousness, rather it's purity. Right, so that once you become impure and then you go through the purification process, immersing in the mikveh, etc., waiting for nightfall, whatever is required for the type of impurity that you contracted, then once that impurity passes, you become pure again. And you could certainly be, ritually pure. You can become tahor again, and be a person with all kinds of sins in your past that stole from others, maybe even killed a person. And you would be technically tahor, you'd be ritually pure, but you would have, tremendous atoning to do for your transgressions to get your level of righteousness back up, as it were. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 6 at 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.